that we have from 1 Samuel chapter 30. David facing a complete destruction of his world and perhaps the loss of his life to his angry men. And we read, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." You've probably heard many quotations that remind us to depend on the Lord. One from the Psalms is, "I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, who made the heavens and the earth." One from the Gospel of John is, "I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing." Yes, we know many quotations that remind us to depend on the Lord. But when life moves along in familiar patterns, we can sometimes feel quite self-sufficient. Our health is reasonably good. We have a roof over our heads, food on the table, and the bills we have to pay seem to be under control. And then something can come along that reminds us that things can go very wrong. A few months ago, over 30,000 people in this world might have had a sense that they were reasonably self-sufficient. And now a virus has ended their natural lives. For many others, the jobs and income they relied on have suddenly ceased to exist, with uncertainty clouding when they might be able to return to work again. The story I read of David's band of men returning to a sacked and burned Ziklag is an ancient example of a massive tragedy. For David and his men, their wives, children, homes, and possessions had all been lost during their absence. Their reactions included overwhelming grief. As 1 Samuel states, "Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no power to weep." But there was also tremendous anger. David's men in their loss and desire for someone to blame talked of stoning him, making him responsible for their loss. This would not have brought back their wives and children. It would not have erased the sadness. In this apparently hopeless situation, we read that David strengthened himself in the Lord. And from this strength, David sought the Lord's guidance of what they should do next. For them, the story had a happy ending. They were able to rescue their wives and children. They were able to regain their possessions and far more. Now, consider what Jesus was facing as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, sometimes Jesus felt that he was one with the infinite God. Other times he felt like a frail and fallible human being. This prayer is one of those latter times. Jesus knew that he was facing arrest, being beaten and whipped, and then crucified. But much, much more challenging, he knew he was going to face his deepest and most draining spiritual battle. It was not something that he welcomed. He prayed, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." The upcoming temptation was going to strain Jesus to the utmost. Over and over again, we will face the results of tragedies, disorders, and outright evil in this world. We will be saddened by these results, and we will be tempted to have a number of reactions that are dangerous to our own spiritual welfare and to the welfare of those around us. There are evil spirits who seek to poison our mind with hatred, bog us down with hopelessness, or cripple us with fear and mistrust. We can feel abandoned by God. When we don't sense God's help, we can think that He has chosen the consequence that we are facing. We're told very clearly in the teachings for the new church that not all things that happen are what the Lord wants. Reading from the Divine Providence. When we say, therefore, that God allows something to happen, we do not mean that He wills it, but that for the sake of the goal, which is salvation, He cannot prevent it. Whatever happens for the sake of salvation is the goal, happens in accord with the laws of divine providence. Consequently, at every moment of its operation, at every step of its progress, when it sees that we stray from the goal, it guides, bends, and directs us in accordance with its laws, withdrawing us from evil, leading us to good. And this cannot take place without the permitting of evil. We're called to see the Lord as a God of infinite love, wisdom, and power. We're told that the Lord is caring for each of us every least fraction of a moment. And yet this is not always the way it appears. God may seem distant in sad situations, such as when a baby is born with severe birth defects, or the tragic death of a child or young person just entering the prime of life, or a parent leaving behind a spouse and children. The Lord can seem distant when elderly people feel alone and useless, and when their natural bodies have gotten so old that they hinder them every moment. Such a person can feel burdened and like a problem to others. How are we to make sense of events that seem far more destructive than constructive? How are we expected to feel? We know that when a person dies, the only thing that is really dead is something purely natural, their physical body. However, that physical body was extremely important. By means of it, a person's spirit has been able to exist, to learn, make choices, and through these choices can serve others in this world. Though something merely natural, that physical body is very important. Similarly, when a tragedy strikes in this world, harming some other natural thing that has been of use, we can appropriately feel sadness at that loss. When people lose their jobs and the income it provided, their ability to support their life is threatened. The sense of loss need not come from a materialistic love. Certainly the Lord encourages us not to put our hearts on natural things, but when we value the use of a natural thing, we are not valuing the natural thing so much as the use that it served. So once again I ask, why do bad things happen? I would say a wise answer is not that it's the Lord's plan. If we assume that everything is determined to happen the way it happens, we can become apathetic. For example, a person can say, I don't need to wear a seatbelt. When my time is up, I'll die, and that's that. This perspective taken to an extreme would say we really don't need to worry about any decisions because the Lord is controlling all things. The truth is that things happen that the Lord does not want to have happen. There are things that happen that are extremely destructive of the goals he seeks to accomplish with his infinite love and wisdom. Some people have tried to understand bad things by thinking that God has only part of the power that governs the universe. Some have seemed to personify an evil force entirely separate from the Lord, vying with him for control. And sometimes the Lord wins, and sometimes the Prince of Darkness wins. But as the interlude, we just heard a beautiful version of the Lord's Prayer sung. It ends with the words familiar to us, "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever." We don't say part of the power. In a very real sense, nothing happens apart from the Lord's government. Nothing is completely out of control. But this does not mean that bad things are what the Lord wants to have happen. Instead, we're told that some things happen directly according to his will, things that he really wants to have happen. Some things happen only partially according to what the Lord wants, and some things happen contrary to what he would want. Such things are said in the teachings for the new church to be permitted or allowed by the Lord. Why are they permitted or allowed? Why doesn't the Lord intervene to stop these things? The reason is that he cannot intervene without causing greater harm than benefit. It can be hard to understand. The key reason for why he cannot intervene is that it is absolutely essential for our happiness that genuine spiritual freedom exists. Without the freedom to choose between good and evil, between true ideas and false ones, we cease to be human. And it's only to the degree that we choose to receive the Lord's love and wisdom that we can feel happiness. But it's also important that we recognize that bad things that happen are not always a consequence of our own choices or of some lesson that we need to learn. While it is true that the Lord works to bring some good out of all things that happen, even those that are terribly destructive, it is not necessarily the way the Lord would most want us to gain that benefit, and doesn't necessarily reflect a problem that we needed to face. When a person faces a series of challenges in his life, sometimes the way he looks at it is reflected in the words, "I guess the Lord is trying to teach me something." If this implies that the Lord chose these events with a lesson in mind, I think it doesn't reflect the way the Lord really operates. He never wishes that bad things happen, even for the sake of teaching us some lesson. When destructive things happen, it is not always something that the Lord wanted. It can be something that he allowed to happen, even though he would wish things were very different. The Lord is constantly working to accomplish his goals in our lives. But there are two other influences he permits that also interfere with what he wants. Firstly, our individual freedom can have us make choices that hurt us and others. We know that people can make profoundly bad decisions that have terrible consequences. But there's also a second force, one that exists because hell exists. Accidents, sickness, and other tragedies can occur whose consequences far exceed the significance of any individual person's choice. A moment's inattention while driving can result in a terrible car accident. Is the driver responsible for this consequence? I don't think we should think so. A person can slip, fall, and hurt himself, perhaps even lose his life. Is he responsible for this death because where he placed his foot, or for being in a situation where he could slip? I think not. Some bad things happen because the Lord permits even the evil spirits of hell to have some freedom. They, using their life, which they've received from the Lord and perverted, can produce tragedies in this world. These tragedies do not reflect a proper consequence of choices by people in this world. The influence of the hells can produce sickness and natural disasters. They can produce tragedies that seem so random and without clear explanation that they're popularly called acts of God. But in reality, it would probably be wiser if we called them acts of hell. We're called to trust that even in these terribly destructive events, we've not been abandoned by the Lord. Consider the following words from the teachings for the new church. From this, it may be seen how far someone errs who believes that the Lord has not foreseen and does not see the smallest individual thing with a person, and that within the smallest individual thing, he does not foresee and lead, when in fact the Lord's foresight and providence are present within the tiniest details of all the smallest individual things with a person, in details so tiny that it's impossible to comprehend in any manner of thought, one in many millions of them. So if you could think of all the things the Lord's doing in your life, all the things you're grateful for, all the ways in which you can imagine He's led you forward, this is saying, take that, multiply it by many millions, and you start to approach what the Lord's been doing in each of our lives. We're called to trust in the Lord's loving care. This trust will not be an easy matter when loved ones and our financial security is at risk. At times, many of us will inevitably go through feelings of sadness and even anger. But the Lord would lead us to a peacefulness that can follow our initial reaction. May our trust in the Lord grow stronger every day. This will come to us as we face the ups and downs of life and seek to acknowledge that even though things are not the Lord's will, He can still work to accomplish some good. We can ask for an underlying peace even as we deal with problems and sadness. When facing hard times, we too can strengthen ourselves in the Lord. Amen.